You know what's a really scary topic? Economics. Economics is one of these fields of study where you can have a really good idea and it works wonders in one place and then it destroys another, right? You can have a certain policy and maybe it works really well in the US. You pass the same exact law in Canada, it might cripple and decimate the economy. It might ruin everything. And there is no real rhyme or reason. It's very complex voodoo magic in many ways. And the system that we're living under right now, right, capitalism, is very young. This is a system that has existed for less than 300 years. I mean, think about how young that is, right? That is not very long. And understandably, it has some problems. Now, one of the most prominent thinkers to point those problems out have been Karl Marx. So in this episode, we are going to be exploring the Communist Manifesto, Karl Marx's most notorious, infamous, and sometimes beloved piece of writing ever. It is probably the most influential piece of writing in economic left-wing history, right? It's even widely read today. So it's really important to understand it, whether you lean left, you lean right, or something else, right? Whatever your position is, it's important to understand what Karl Marx says because he's had a lot of influence. There are people today that call themselves Marxists. Why do they think this way? Why do they believe this, right? We're going to get to the bottom of all of it in this episode. Hello there, my friend. Welcome back to History for Thinkers, a show that brings history to life. I want to give a massive thank you to everyone over on Patreon for supporting the show. You guys rock. If you want to get exclusive content and a shout out at the start of every episode like Matthew and Tomas here, you can head on over to the Patreon page linked in the description or the show notes. Now, let's get into the Communist Manifesto. Actually, I do want to get your opinion real quick. What do you guys think about this gradient blue background? Right? I think I kind of like this a little bit more than that, just plain dark one that I've been using for a little while now. But, let me know what you guys think, right? At the end of the day, you guys have to watch the stuff. So, it's whatever you guys want. Now, let's understand some context about the Communist Manifesto because that's the key to understanding what it is Marx is saying here. So, this was published as a pamphlet in 1848. Came during a rise of revolutionary sentiment, so people were pissed off and angry and they were getting abused for a very long time by this point, right? Industrial capitalism came around in, I think we said the 1700s, late 1700s, and it was just not perfect at the start, right? And, every iteration of things are bad, but dang, going through industrialization, man, it was kind of rough, right? You had child labor and, 16-hour work days, and it was just miserable stuff. So people were understandably pretty pissed off. Now, the manifesto itself is written by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. People kind of forget about Engels because, according to him, he was the second fiddle to Karl Marx. He was kind of a number two, despite financially supporting Marx, right? He was more or less Marx's sugar daddy, right? As far as I know, they were not homosexual or anything, but Engels had inherited a whole bunch of money, businesses, right? He had, factories in the UK, in Germany, right? He was a pretty wealthy, well-to-do guy. And he kind of supported Marx and said, you know what, we're going to try to, start this revolution, right? I'm on board, right? Even though I'm a business owner and I have stuff to lose, I'm on board with this stuff. So that kind of gives you some insight onto Engels. But he did financially support Marx. Now, these guys were not just thinkers, right? And this is something that I do kind of like and admire about them. They are not writing or thinking just, for their own sake, right? They want to change the world. And there's just something about wanting to change the world, right? With real actions in the real world that have real consequences. There's something about that is very appealing, right? Even if it's not a good outcome, right? Because at the very least, we can learn from it. Now, the Communist Manifesto is divided into 4 sections, and we're going to kind of tackle the content in a similar way, although some sections have more meat than others. So let's start with section number 1, entitled Bourgeois and Proletarians. So Marx writes, quote, "The history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggles." This is a very prominent idea in left-wing thought. The idea that there is inherent conflicts between different classes of people in society. Now, Marx categorizes this more or less as the oppressor and the oppressed, although there's a little bit more nuance there. In our modern world, it comes down to owner versus worker, right? So the capitalist, right, someone that's the business owner, they own the factory, they earn money through ownership of a business or, means of production, right? This can also be a landlord, right? Someone that owns a house and they rent it out to you so you can live there, right? These people, the capitalists, the owner class, or the bourgeoisie, as Marx calls them, they essentially get paid, right? They make all this money for not really doing anything. Their inputs are like basically zero, and they get pretty much all the money and wealth in society, which they can then use to increase their money and wealth, right? And then you compare that with the proletariat, right? The wage worker. So this is someone who earns money through working at the means of production. So they go to the factory, they are working 16 hours a day, they don't get paid enough to really start their own business or anything. Hell, they barely get enough money to live, right? Can't even feed their kids, especially during this period of time. So there is a lot of conflict there. To understand why these two classes of people are in perpetual conflict, let's make it modern, right? Let's talk about a local McDonald's, right? It's a pretty popular business. So if you are a capitalist, you own that McDonald's, right? It is the means of production. Now, the really good thing about it is you don't have to show up. You don't really have to do anything, right? You can pretty much get the entire McDonald's running on autopilot and you make money just by existing, right? More or less. Now, there's really only one way that you can increase your profit, right? You can pay your people less. That is, one of your biggest expenses, right? That's why today a lot of different businesses, from McDonald's to Walmart and everything else, they are trying to use technology more and more. It is simply cheaper and more efficient and easier if you can use robots to do pretty much all the work, right? Now this goes in direct contrast to what the proletariat wants. They want to work, but not too much. They want to get paid a fair wage. They want to have free time, a family, and, maybe be able to afford a house, advance their own life, maybe save up and start their own business one day. But in order for them to be able to afford all that stuff, it goes against the capitalist profit, right? So that owner of McDonald's does not want their workers to be making too much money that they can go start their own business, right? It might be competition, or heck, it's just one less worker, right? And that means all the other workers that stay, they have a little bit more bargaining power, and, right, you guys can kind of naturally see there is conflict between these two classes of people, and we'll explore a little bit more later on. But this class conflict, right, inherently goes beyond capitalism. So Marx believed class conflict is inherent to human nature. It's pretty much always been there throughout history any way you spin it. There's always someone that is some kind of owner and someone that is some kind of worker. There is someone that is the oppressor and someone that is oppressed. That is what Marx believes to be, pretty much core to human history. And it's, you can kind of compare it to feudalism, right? Now there are some differences between capitalism and feudalism, but Marx sees the big similarity, right? There's the owner class, right? Whether that's the owner of McDonald's or a lord, right? Pretty much the same thing. They own the property, they own the land, they own the means of production. And then there is the worker or the serf or the peasant, right? Whatever it is. You can change the names of the classes, but the classes still fundamentally exist. And he actually says that feudalism had more classes, right? So there was a little bit more gradation there where you can be like, a small lower nobility, right? Like that was kind of a thing. Whereas today, there's just increasingly two classes. There are business owners and there are people who work the businesses. So he talks a lot about feudalism actually, because especially you got to think during this time, it was still in recent memory. It's kind of ancient to us today. But you got to think they are operating with just having gotten away from feudalism. So Marx argued that the bourgeoisie led revolutions against, quote, feudal patriarchal idyllic relations. So the bourgeoisie, right, the modern day business owners are the ones that pretty much did away with this system, right? And what this did was it removed a sense of purpose from all relations. Right? No longer are you, related to people in some kind of, obligatory way, right? It is just all economic self-interest, right? There's no more honor, no more sentimentality, no more religious fervor, right? There's no more chivalry. It's just economic self-interest. And that is kind of the cynical observation that Marx makes of modern capitalism. One of the many ways that it has been bad for humankind. So he argues that it has degraded all work into mere wages. It has turned everything into a commodity, whether you are a well-respected doctor or you're a typical wage worker in some factory somewhere. Doesn't matter what you are, we've all been degraded to more or less being machines. That's more or less what we have become. So now we can move on to one of Marx's best criticisms of the capitalist regime. Quote, the executive of the modern state is but a committee for managing the common affairs of the whole bourgeoisie. So what's he saying here? Marx is saying that the government and big business are in bed. They are buddy-buddy, and there's nothing that we can really do about it. Right? You think about big businesses buying politicians. It goes on all the time. Right? We all know what's happening, but is there really much that we can even do about it? Not really, no. And he also makes the point that global capitalism expands and eventually envelops the entire earth. So for any country that is isolationist or, they just want to stick to their own ways, it's just inevitable that they will have to join the global economic, system. Right? I think a good example is Eastern Asia during the, industrialization period, right? Especially Japan, right? They had their own closed off society, their own little island. They were off doing their own thing, and that was good for them. But, sooner or later, the global capitalist powers more or less forced them to start trading, right? Open your ports for trade. And the free market came to Japan. And that's, Marx argues, right? This is just the way it goes. Because it couples very well with this other idea that the economy must grow, right? If the economy doesn't, if there is no new wealth generated, pretty much the system collapses, right? You got to think, what would happen if the GDP in the United States started going down, right? Pretty scary stuff, right? And even, small increases in the GDP and the economy, still pretty scary, right? Just the small ones, right? Because sometimes it's not enough. We want more. We want more. So ultimately, capitalism has forced every nation on earth into capitalism, right? Everywhere is capitalist, right? Even the countries that claim they are not, right? North Korea, Cuba, they still have some elements of the free market in them. Now, it might be the black market, right? It might be illegal, but capitalism is there. And this is where Marx writes that capitalism, quote, creates a world after its own image. So it influences and changes everything. It's the most powerful system ever. It swallowed the whole earth in just a few hundred years, right? We're all living in a capitalist world, whether you think that's a good or a bad thing. So Karl Marx argues for the communist revolution, and he believes that this is the final class conflict, right? Again, there have been different class conflicts throughout the ages, and it always results in the lower class overthrowing the upper class, right? Sooner or later. But today we have, a simplified two-class divide, right? There are the people that own, and there are the people that work. And he writes that exploitation was once veiled in ideology, right? It's not anymore. It is no longer veiled in some kind of Christian idealism or chivalry or, even patriotism, right? It's just all ruthless economic self-interest. He also believes that the means of production must continually revolutionize. So what does that mean, right? Things have to continue to get better, which means more technological advancement, which means more workers get, less mastery over their domains, right? You got to think even during the 1900s, there were lots of factories that started embracing the assembly line. And the assembly line was, it was good for business owners because it was very good for the way that you can create a car. You can make them much more efficiently, much faster, at a cheaper cost. But you remove something from the work itself, right? Because now instead of building, some masterpiece that you work on for a couple weeks, you have an assembly line. And you sit there and you do one very tedious, repetitive, monotonous task all day long. You get paid peanuts compared to the owner, and then you go home. And then you go home, and that's it. Marx believes that the communist revolution is inevitable, and it's really been enabled by the bourgeoisie themselves. So he more or less argues that they pay workers as little as possible, right, while they reap all these massive profits. So you look at, like Standard Oil, right? The people that worked for Standard Oil did not get paid a whole lot of money. But then there was, Rockefeller, and he was richer than hell. I mean, Jesus, imagine having so much money, especially during then, before inflation, right? Must have been nice. And on top of that, these business owners, they don't work themselves, right? So right now, this system has the wage slaves, the workers, working all the time, working their asses off in miserable conditions and barely getting anything in return, right? Just enough money to live. Meanwhile, the people that own the businesses get all the surplus value. All of it, right? So Marx writes, quote, "What the bourgeoisie therefore produces above all are its own grave diggers. Its fall and the victory of the proletariat are equally inevitable." He thinks that sooner or later, people are going to wake up. They're going to smell the coffee. They're going to feel the chains that have shackled them down into wage slavery for the big capitalist business owners, right? This is what he believes. And you got to think, right? This was before child labor laws, workers' rights of any kind, the 40-hour work week, even weekends, right? So I just want you to imagine you are a 10-year-old child. You work 16 hours a day, every single day. You are not paid enough to adequately feed yourself, right? Especially because the money probably goes to your parents. And even then, your entire family is working all the time, and there's no room for growth or anything, right? And just surviving is miserable. And there were a lot of people in a situation like that, which is why I think, as radical as this manifesto gets, right? Because it does get there. I think it's because people felt so much pain, and it just became logical, right? The business owners weren't cracking. The government was only helping the business owners. So we've got to have a communist revolution. So Marx argues that the worker has essentially been reduced to an appendage of the machine, right? Essentially a commodity, right? Something that can be bought and sold and traded, right? As if it were a piece of plastic. Now, the real problem is that survival is dependent on labor creating capital. So if you're a worker and you are no longer capable of working to produce capital, right? You have no value. You're basically left to rot and die. And on top of that, they are vulnerable to market fluctuations. So all of a sudden there's this big new trend and, all of a sudden the skill that you have specialized in isn't relevant anymore. You are out on your ass. You're homeless. Your kids are hungry. That is the way it goes. Marx also compares the worker to something like a slave and a soldier at the same time. A little bit of both. And Marx believes that this current industrial system, right, the capitalism of his time, it was just constant exploitation, right? You go to work, you are exploited by your boss, right? You get paid pennies, they make a whole bunch of money, they get rich, even richer, and then you go home, right? Well, you don't own a home, right? You don't have enough money to own a home. You're not nobility after all. So you have to rent. And then you get robbed by your landlord because guess what? They can just charge you rent. And, if they say that rent's going to be 5 times more expensive this month, that's it, right? You don't have any bargaining power. Otherwise, you're homeless, right? So Marx observed that the middle class had essentially been destroyed, right? Now, these were formerly the small tradespeople, not the millionaires, right? Not the really wealthy people, but people that made an honest living, right? Working for themselves, right? Something like, almost think of them like freelancers or just small business owners today, right? They've essentially been carved out, don't really exist. And it's because, Marx argues, there is a lack of capital in order to, keep their businesses afloat or to, continue to produce more money. So these people that were formerly, a dignified class, they are now reduced to the proletariat. And then on top of that, right, industrialization kind of makes them irrelevant. How many cobblers do you know? Even know what a cobbler is? A cobbler is someone that used to work on shoes, right? They used to be these really skilled craftsmen. They developed an art and a mastery over the ability to make and fix shoes. Well, the factory came around and we can make sneakers, we can make like a gazillion of them with very little creative input or even work, right? So cobblers kind of went out of business. And even the really skilled, well-respected people in society, during Marx's time and even our own, right, they're pretty much paid peanuts in comparison to what the business owners make, right? You think about how much a doctor makes, or maybe a programmer, right? Someone that has mastered a really important and difficult skill. They make peanuts compared to what the business owners make. So this is why Marx concludes that the bourgeoisie is unfit to rule. They fail to meet even the most basic needs of workers. Right? You cannot possibly live being a child, working 16 hours a day in the coal mines and you're dying and you're not paid enough to live. Like, it's just terrible life conditions. And they cannot provide, quote, an existence to its slave within its slavery. So it's bad enough that the working class has been reduced to slavery, but they cannot even exist as slaves because the capitalist business owners are trying to take away, even the most basic stuff. Even the most basic stuff. And this is why Marx believes that proles must destroy all existing society. Right? After all, they have nothing to lose. Right? Nothing to defend. They don't own any homes. They just don't own anything. They don't really have much. They rent in the cities. They work at these crappy jobs, and that's their life. That's their life, and there's no reason for them not to destroy everything. So that was all section 1. Let's get into section number 2 here, entitled Proletarians and Communists. So he argues that communists should support any working class parties, right? But there is a fundamental distinction between communists and other working class groups, right? the communist wants to advocate for international working people uniting, right? Workers of the world unite, right? Those famous words. It is all workers everywhere. It doesn't matter if you are Chinese or German or American or whatever else, right? We're all workers. We're all exploited by the same people. So we need to come together and, establish communism, right? He also addresses some criticisms of communism in this section. We're not going to go through all of them, but we will acknowledge his rebuttal to one of the big ones, and that is no one will work, right? This is very common. People say, if we implement communism, no one's ever going to do anything, right? Because we're all equal. You get the same no matter what, right? Well, Marx argued that as the system currently stands, workers get nothing, and the people who don't work get everything. Like, you could not create a worse system than what we have now. And then, my friend, do you know what's next? It's the infamous part of this manifesto, the 10 planks of communism. So we'll just run through these a little quickly. So there is number 1, the abolition of property in land and application of all rents of land to public purposes. So, basically get rid of private property. Right? When you look at society at that time, right, it was something like 9/10 of society had no property anyway, right? There was probably about 10% of the population that actually owned anything, right? So it didn't really matter. And I actually really like this way that Marx responded to this criticism when he wrote, quote, "In one word, you reproach us with intending to do away with your property. Precisely so. That is just what we intend." Right? So, listen, man, that's not a criticism. That is our goal. We are trying to take away your property. So, plank number 2, a heavy progressive or graduated income tax. Right? So, the more you make, the more the government's gonna take. Number 3, abolition of all rights of inheritance. So, if you are born the son of a rich person, you don't get some kind of special privileges, you don't get special advantages, right? And ideally, that would mean that everyone has some kind of vested interest in making the country as good as possible. All right. Then there's number 4, confiscation of the property of all immigrants and rebels. Number 5, the centralization of credit in the hands of the state by means of a national bank with state capital and an exclusive monopoly. And this is where we start getting into the really authoritarian ones, right? Because number 6 here is the centralization of the means of communication and transport in the hands of the state. So you cannot go anywhere or communicate with anyone without the government's approval in some way, shape, or form. Then there's number 7, the extension of factories and instruments of production owned by the state, the bringing into cultivation of wastelands, and the improvement of the soil generally in accordance with a common plan. So, more or less, a planned economy. Number 8, equal liability of all to work, establishment of industrial armies, especially for agriculture. So he doesn't want there to be an owner class sitting around collecting money anymore, right? Everyone's got to work. You got to do your part. Number 9, combination of agriculture with manufacturing industries, gradual abolition of all the distinction between town and country by a more equitable distribution of the populace over the country. So he wants to get rid of the regionalism, different populations, right? It's very necessary for communism to see everyone as the same, right? And this is, of course, going to run into some problems because people have different cultures and ethnicities and languages and ideas, and it's just going to get very messy real fast. But again, we'll save some of this for the analysis. Then there is number 10, free education for all children in public schools, abolition of children's factory labor in its present form, combination of education with industrial production. Right? I think this number 10, you're at least a decent one, right? Because more or less we have adopted that in the developed world. And that's pretty much it for section number 2. So now we can move to number 3, the socialist and communist literature. So he criticizes some of the other forms of socialism, right? Because you got to think there are many different forms of socialism. Communism is actually just a branch of socialism. So socialism, the core idea behind it is that there is social ownership of the means of production. That means that the people that work in the factories or at McDonald's, the people that work it should own it, right? They should be able to profit from their own labor, right? And you compare that with communism that wants the collective ownership of everything, right? All means of production. But in addition to that, it wants it through the state, right? So state socialism, right? And that's kind of the big distinction between communism and socialism, right? Socialism is not inherently through the government, although sometimes it can be. But when it is called communism. That's the big difference there. So Marx rejects all other forms of socialism as reactionary reformers, right? Basically a bunch of clowns. He actually walks through and pretty much roasts all other forms of socialism that were at least popular during his time. Now, we are not going to go through every single one of them because I just don't think they're relevant anymore. People don't think this way for the most part, right? Are you a feudal socialist, right? I've never heard of that, right? That's not a popular idea anymore. It was during Marx's time, which is why he felt it was necessary to address their points and debunk them. But I don't know any feudal socialists, I'm sure there's going to be someone in the comments section that says they are a feudal socialist, and I really should have included that part. But listen, man, if you really want to read it, you can read the manifesto yourself, you feudal socialist fool. But let's address one of the more important groups that he criticizes, what he calls the conservative socialists, because this is more or less the form of socialism that we have seen in the Western world since this time. So this essentially boils down to what we have today in the West, where the working class has been given certain rights and privileges, and it's gotten a little bit better, right? We've got a minimum wage. We've got workers' rights, anti-discrimination stuff, right? There is a weekend. There is welfare, unemployment benefits. These are all things that make the life of the working class better. And Marx had a lot of problems with this, right? Because he noted that it does improve life for the proletariat. It makes life better for the working class, but it maintains capitalism, and that fundamentally is the problem with it. So Marx ultimately believed that the system had to be destroyed and rebuilt. You cannot reform capitalism. It has to be burned to the ground, and you got to start from scratch. That is the only way to do it. And then we can move on to section number 4, the position of the communists in relation to the various existing opposition parties. So this is actually one of the shorter sections where, he more or less encourages communists to work with other revolutionary movements, right? Whatever kind of revolutionary you are, join us. And this was one of the big reasons that communism led the left during this time and then going into the 1900s, because they wanted to work with anyone, right? Get your goals accomplished, right? And this really started this whole idea of the ends justify the means. All the terrible things that happened under communist regimes were to bring about some kind of workers' paradise, some kind of utopia. A utopia that many have argued cannot exist. And that, this ends justify the means thing, that's going to kill a lot of people. Probably one of the most destructive ideas present in the Communist Manifesto. And I want to iterate, Karl Marx does not come out and say that the ends justify the means, right? He doesn't say it explicitly, but it is implied. It is very strongly implied. And he ends the entire manifesto with a very strong call to action. Quote, "Let the ruling classes tremble at a communistic revolution. The proletarians have nothing to lose but their chains. They have a world to win. Working men of all countries, unite." Right, just very edgy stuff right here. And actually in modern times, this has actually been changed a little bit. It's workers of the world unite, right? Got to include women workers in that as well. So now we are going to move into some of my own analysis and my own thoughts. If you only wanted to hear about the Communist Manifesto, like you wanted a good summary, a good explanation, there it is. Now we are kind of departing from that. We're going to analyze some of what's going on here. So one of the criticisms Marx had that really struck a chord was that government serves big business. And as an American, man, it just kind of rings true, right? There is a degree of truth in this idea, right? And, there's a modern conception among, some of my peers, a lot of people I know, because they think that, the more government influence you have in the economy or anything really, the more corrupt and the more cronyism that's going to go on. But really it comes down to the way the government is used, right? The government passing more laws does not necessarily restrict freedom or help businesses or hurt businesses or corporations or whatever, right? It is the way it is done. You got to think, the government could pass a law tomorrow and they can say, oh, hey, if you start a small business for yourself, you go into business for you, and you go out there, you're not going to pay any tax for 10 years. They could totally do that. There is nothing stopping them from doing that. But guess what? They don't. They don't do it. So it's not so much that more government is bad, but, again, it's just the way it goes about it, right? So there's just, again, a lot of nuance and a lot of gray area in politics and economics, and especially where politics and economics overlap, right? I think another good example is this news story I saw not too long ago, a couple days ago, where Apple, right, the big company, software, right, iPhone, they more or less strong-armed Georgia politicians to not pass a law that would have been bad for their businesses, right? So, this goes on, right? This goes on, and, that's an example that I don't even think anyone cares, right? It's like a big multinational corporation can come in and strong-arm our elected representatives, and people don't even say anything about it. Like, it's just expected. Like, people just, yeah, this goes on. Yeah, so what? What else is new? Like, there's almost an apathy about it, and I think that's probably the saddest part. That, what Marx is criticizing in the 1800s has become a sad reality for people that live under capitalist regimes. Another idea that was kind of tricky was the abolition of private property, right? Because even Marx acknowledged some of the early communes in America, specifically. Because that's where people went, right? A lot of cheap land there. You had some money in Europe. You got your people together and you went over, bought some land in America, started your commune. A lot of people did that, and almost all of them failed. Right? Marx denounced them as utopians, right? Which is kind of funny because most Marxists today get denounced as utopians. So it's funny to see how, kind of how it goes. But I think this gets us at, what do we do about that, right? So I think a good alternative to abolition of private property, which is clearly not ever going to work, but maybe putting some kind of limit on private property, right? Like maybe the idea that you can just own more and more and in theory own everything, maybe there is a more realistic solution to some of the problems. So this is one of the big problems with communism, is that violence as a political means is inherently wrong and counterproductive. Because Karl Marx, he encourages violence, right? When you want a revolution, you want people to die. You were saying that it is okay to slaughter people and murder the Tsar and kill his children, right? I mean, just all the terrible things that happen, right? I don't care how bad the system is. There is just no reason that children ever have to be slaughtered, right? And when you look at the communist revolution in Russia, they went to the Tsar's house, they killed his kids. They slaughtered children. That is not something that can be justified. That is not a good position to have. Not least because it is counterproductive, right? You do all this crazy violent shit, it does more harm than good. You shoot yourself in the foot and stop people from sympathizing. That is the big problem there, right? So not only is it morally wrong to be violent and kill people, right, which should be obvious, but then there's also the idea that you do more harm than good, right? I kind of remember there's this clip that went viral a little while ago, Antifa, right? And, they were getting violent, they're burning stuff down, and they're just, causing chaos. And at one point, this one Antifa guy gets on this camera and he's like, we're coming for the suburbs next, right? More or less threatening the, typical working class Americans out there, right? People that are just not entrenched in this political subculture of fighting and revolting all the time. And that just does more harm than good. If you genuinely believe in, whether it's socialism or capitalism or whatever your political ideas are, do not enforce violence to get your way, because it will do more harm than good. It will hurt you more than it helps you. Because, normal people see that and they're like, wow, Antifa, they're a bunch of violent thugs, aren't they? Yeah, some of them are, yeah, definitely. And in many ways, when you look at communism, the movement, it is almost directly responsible for fascism. Now, I include almost because I don't like to be hyperbolic. I want to be as close to the truth as possible. But I think there is a very good argument to make that fascism and Nazism were simply a reaction to communism. It is a natural reaction, right? We're going to unite against this communistic threat. They're trying to abolish our private property, right? And there are a lot of people that understandably would rather that extreme than the other. You just look at a lot of the moderates that lived through Germany, right? When the Nazis and the communists were fighting, the Nazis just looked like a less evil group of people to join. And that, right? I mean, it's the Nazis, right? They killed they did a lot of harm and a lot of bad to a lot of people. And when you look worse than them, that's not good, right? That's not good. And I think there's a really good case to say that communism created fascism and Nazism, and right, it's just all one big chain reaction that resulted in the deaths of millions. One of the points that really struck a chord with me throughout this entire, all the research and writing I've done for this episode is some of his criticisms of conservative socialism. Because conservative socialism really more is what we have today, right? America, right? When people say that welfare or social security is socialism, they are in a sense right. But it is conservative socialism, right? Marx wanted to restructure society completely. He didn't think that there was anything that we could do within the capitalist system to, create dignity for the working class. But there are programs that can provide bargaining power for workers, right? I think one of the best examples is Milton Friedman's UBI. So Milton Friedman is this very famous American economist, right? Hardcore free market thinker. You could probably call him a libertarian. And he made a very solid case for universal basic income. And he argued that it maximized human freedom. It, actually did more harm to government power than it did good, right? It gets rid of a lot of the bureaucracy. He called it a negative income tax. And he, argued that this is just what it should, this is what the free market should do to, make the market more free, right? And I think that's something that could provide a lot of benefits to the working class where life wouldn't be so miserable, right? Because let's acknowledge there is a lot of misery if you are poor in America or, honestly poor anywhere, but even in somewhere like America, the richest country on earth. We have more material wealth than any other civilization in human history. And then we still have all these homeless people, right? There are like over 100,000 homeless children in the United States today, right? So I do think that Marx and the left, they do have some very valid criticisms of the United States and capitalism and, this economic system that we all exist under, right? And I just can't help but think that something like UBI or, something like that, right? And Milton Friedman's idea has to be better than unions, right? Because, I'm not going to get too into the union thing because it is a very complex topic, but unions are a response to bad working conditions, right? And the idea is that all the workers come together, they join a union, and then they can bargain with the company that employs them. So let's say there were a union for McDonald's workers, right? They come together and they say, you know what? We're not going to serve your, fast food shit anymore unless you can start paying us $15 an hour. We're not working for minimum wage anymore. Screw you. In theory, it sounds nice, but you know what? I have a family friend, I don't want to get into specifics for legal reasons, but they work at a big company. And the factory workers, they're more or less a manager. So they're not part of the union, but the factory workers are. And the people that work in this factory, sometimes they show up to work drunk. Sometimes they just completely half-ass it. They show up late to their shifts. And the company cannot do anything to fire them. So there are problems with unions because, they'll protect the lazy do-nothings of the world, right? It's kind of what they do. And their hope is that they do more good than harm, but in a lot of ways, they do still do harm. Now, the answer is not to gut all the unions because, right, when you gut all the unions, you give all the bargaining power over to the business owners. So, you see, it just becomes a very, very complicated topic very quickly. And, it gets at this idea that we started talking about with. Economics is not a science. You cannot have a right or a wrong answer. It's just there's a lot of nuance and different ideas, and sometimes the way you apply an idea is more important than the idea itself. But my friends, that is going to be it for the episode. If you guys are still interested in hearing more about Marx and some of his ideas, I actually just recently released an episode of 5 of Marx's best ideas. So I will leave a link to that in the description and hopefully the pinned comment if I remember. But yeah, very interesting stuff. And if you like this, I'm sure you will like that too. But that is going to be it for the episode. Thank you so much for watching all the way through. This has been Michael from History for Thinkers. I'll see you in the next one. Peace out.